so relieved you used AI because, we need to use that term of art in every podcast now. So thank you.
As long as you consider water just the stuff you drink, it'll always face these problems and will never get beyond these problems in order to deal with the larger hydrological cycle.
I'd love to kind of get your quite candid take on this utopic vision of a systems thinking approach to water. Do you think it's possible in our lifetimes? Well, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Stream podcast with Will and Tom, an unscripted, unedited, free-flowing conversation featuring guests who reject the status quo with a bias for action in the world of water and beyond. My name is Tom Freyberg. I'm an environmental journalist specializing in water.
And I'm Will Sarni, a water strategy advisor and investor, doing my part to solve wicked water problems.
And we are pleased to almost be reaching the end of season 8, which celebrates legends in water, people who have made a substantial impact in the world of water and beyond. A big thanks, as always, to our ongoing partner and sponsor, Raymond James, and our charity partner, Frank Water. And we are delighted to welcome Usha Rao-Monari, who is a senior partner at Wellers Impact and the former Undersecretary General at the UN. Usha, great to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So Usha, a big fan of your work. I've seen you speak a couple of times at former Global Water Summits as well. And there's loads we want to kind of dive into today in terms of the nexus between water, finance, economics. We're going to talk a bit about FIGS and FIGS, as a Britishman who loves his food, was music to my ears to hear that. But so looking through your resume, you've had multiple, board advisory positions, over 25 years experience in financing and investment. So really, I think what we like to do with guests, particularly on the stream with an audience focused on water, is to sort of really hear your origin story and how you sort of came into the world of water through infrastructure, and then specifically the kind of world of water and economics as well.
Thank you. So, where shall I start? So I've been doing infrastructure for about 2 decades now. And, everybody starts in the same place, which is energy, because that was the one sector or infrastructure asset class that got private funding. And so, I was working at the IFC, which is the private sector part of the World Bank Group. And so we started focusing on that. But I very quickly moved to water because I found it a fascinating sector. It was a sector that IFC had some business in, but not enough. They didn't really have a portfolio. So they handed it to me and said, grow it. And so that's how I got into water. I learned as I did. It was not something I naturally knew. And the more work I did in it, the more I realized that actually financing water from a private sector point of view is quite complex. It's even more complex than energy. It's certainly more complex than toll bridges and roads and whatnot. And so it was just something that, it was a really interesting space to get my hands into. That's how I found myself there.
And Usha, the complexity, and I think Tom and I were both nodding when you said, yes, it's different than energy and complex. Back then, was it an issue of awareness on the value of water? As a cross-cutting issue? Was it because water is local? What did you see back then?
Thank you. Well, actually, you say back then. The tragedy is that it is still relevant.
Well,
everything I'm going to say.
That would be true.
But also back then, yes, it was a question of water not being priced properly or valued properly. It was a question of people considering that water was a local issue and certainly not a global issue. And therefore, it always came to the bottom, if you will, of the political totem pole, where water infrastructure was managed and administered by local officials, mayors and whatnot, district officials and whatnot. It was also, this myth that water can't be transported. It is capital intensive. Why would I put money in? It's a very long-term investment. And that combined with poor pricing made it not everyone's favorite investment destination. That was then. Honestly, I'm not sure how much has changed, but I'm not one to look backwards. I'd rather look forwards and see what has changed for the better and how can we make it even better.
On the, it's interesting. Yeah, totally agree with what you're saying. And it's interesting you mentioned about, water not being valued properly. Do you think over that 25 years, do you think that's changed and improved? Because, one report that springs to mind is the WWF recently sort of came up with a quantifiable number on the value of water, which was $58 trillion, right? Combined GDP of multiple different countries. So suddenly we have if water is a global company, what would it be worth? So do you think that's kind of helped the narrative on this? And do you see things improving a little bit?
So in part, messages and narrative like that helps.
Mm.
But the basic issue is simply that water has never been priced at its cost. Leave alone, life cycle cost, just cost of delivery. Over time, that has improved somewhat. And why is that? Because the public sector officials, who are the counterpart of the private companies, have changed. They are more modern, they understand what the issues are, and compared to their predecessors, they are faced with a very real risk of water crisis. And when you're faced with a very real risk of water crisis, you do make different decisions when it comes to pricing or allocation or signals and so on and so forth. So from a policy point of view, I think things have improved a little bit. So, in various countries, the country I live in, actually Portugal, it's really a very well-managed water sector, to be honest. They have reasonable pricing, they know where the issues are, they know where the assets are, and so on. It's well managed. So I think what's happening now in several countries, not all, is that the administered water sector, so that by that I mean that is provided by the public sector, has different people at the top who understand it. That, though, is still contrasted, and this is my final point on this, by the overall sense that, water is a fundamental human right.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody obviously contradicts that. The issue is around incorporating that fundamental human right into a proper economic model around water. That's what we have to do as we go forward.
Hey, Usha, how does that happen? And do you see it happening in certain geographies? I mean, you talked about Portugal being, a leader in quotes on national water strategy. So yeah, just to kind of unpack this a little bit in terms of, can you price it right, honor that it's a human right, and compensate for those that are disadvantaged, that can't afford the full cost, full price?
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, so if your question is, can it be done? Yes. Has it been done? The answer is in part. Some countries did some of the simpler things around water pricing. So remember, South Africa had this, I think it was called geometric water pricing. So, you use a certain amount and you pay nothing, then you use a little bit more and you pay more, etc. Other countries actually looked at things like life cycle price of water. How much does it actually cost for a water asset to provide water, right? But it's not a complete story, Will. I think that where countries have done well in terms of pricing is to recognize that even if the resource is a fundamental human right by itself, let's say the raw water, the actual delivery of water through pipes and through other infrastructure has to be priced because there's a cost attached to it. So I think when countries follow that kind of pathway, better policy decisions emerge. That's as much as I will say. And by the way, the World Bank has done a very good job of this. The other thing that complicates the pricing issue is the following, that because in the past and even now, public systems have not delivered what they're supposed to deliver, other delivery modes came up. So trucks, for example.
Right.
Bottled water, for example. I mean, I'm sorry to list these things. And they are all priced at a higher price point than the public delivery system. So these are all learnings that clever public officials took into consideration when they put out their pricing. India, for example, my birth country at least, has through JAL, the JAL ministry, which is the water ministry, have done a good job at looking at the pros and cons of pricing water and actually maintaining the water infrastructure in the country. What is always a challenge is politicians and populist opinions, and when they come in and they say, "I'll give you free water," fine, but how are you going to get the free water, and where are you going to get it from, and so on and so forth. That persists. But I have to say, I'm positive. Things are looking up. Things are looking up for water today.
I love how you pointed out the alternative hydration technologies in quotes. So bottled water, trucked water that is higher than more traditional infrastructure. So could there be learnings from those models into some sort of a hybrid centralized water authority? Right? Sort of an interesting.
Possibly. I look at those models as scarcity models.
Oh, yeah.
Because there was a scarcity, or there was a perceived scarcity, and they priced it on that level. For a public water system to do that, they have to actually have a crisis and say, "I can't give you water, because I don't have any," or whatever it is. And that so far hasn't happened, with the exception of a few cities. You remember, what was it, Cape Town, not so long ago, and Ankara in Turkey. I remember all these in my history of cities that suddenly didn't have water to give their citizens. There's one thing I'd like to remind us of, which is the following. Everything we've been talking about is on one segment of the overall hydrological cycle, and I'd like us to keep that in mind. And so Will, you know this, I was a commissioner on something called the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which just recently concluded, right? Mm-hmm. And our whole push there was that as long as you consider water just the stuff you drink, it'll always face these problems, and we'll never get beyond these problems in order to deal with the larger hydrological cycle. So our report, I don't know if you've had a chance to at least look at the executive summary, talks about water management along the whole cycle. Or I prefer to look at it as a continuum rather than a cycle, from access to scarcity and everything in between. And once you start looking at water like that, you figure out, and I've said this, I think, Will, you and I had a conversation about this. Once you put it on a line, you can see what kind of finance and investment is appropriate for what part of the continuum. So if, in my view, when it comes to drinking water, I'm not sure private sector should come in with all their return aspirations, their time aspirations, so on and so forth, to do that. But they could do everything else, and then perhaps public providers will have enough money to actually do a good job on the provision of drinking water. So that's kind of where we came out in that report, or as one of the points. It was just one of the points, not.
I love that point, that water is more than drinking water. And, for me, that I'm going to go back and look at that report now. But, nature strategy, but loss of biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, and the role of water in that sort of natural setting is extremely high value. And we, the royal we, typically forget that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And our report, please do look at it. Our report actually makes a distinction between blue water, which is the water we all know, okay, the stuff we see around us and we can touch and drink and whatnot, and green water, the stuff that goes around atmospheric pathways and so on and so forth. And if you read the report, it'll point out to how countries are connected, yes, because of shared water resources in the ground and on the ground, but also in the air. So it's really actually quite fascinating. So you should look at that report. I'd take 4 days to explain all that to you, so I'm not going to.
We have plenty of time.
We'll have to make sure we share a link to the report in the comments. I think it was Henk Ovink involved in the report as well.
He's a great guy.
former envoy of water in the Netherlands. Yeah, I saw he was one of the names involved.
Wonderful.
It's interesting you mentioned there in terms of the kind of the scale from, I guess, the on the water cycle, and it's a case, I think, of finding the right market and product fit for that finance at the time, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about blended finance, which is a phrase that often comes up, and a mixture between public and private? And do you think that's working? And are there cases where you can see evidence of the blended finance approach, being successful? Or how do you kind of see that as a path forward?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm assuming this is a slightly more general question and not necessarily related to water, although it is related to water also. Look, it's not that blended finance has not worked. We just don't have enough functioning examples of it. Well-functioning examples of it where you can point to it and say, oh, it's working there. We have some, but we don't have a lot. Blended finance, in my view, may have started out, I don't know, somewhat differently than it should have started out. So where we started was to say the blending occurs between types of finance. That was the sort of basis of blended finance. You got private money and you got public money of various sorts. And maybe some philanthropic capital, but that was always tucked into private money, one way or the other. Public and private money. Let's try to put it together in some sort of algorithm to provide, to come up with incredible financing models. Now, that didn't somehow happen for various reasons, and there's many reasons, and I could go into them if you wish, but it didn't work quite as well as we all wanted to. So looking forward, which is what I'd love for us to do in this conversation, I'd like us to see how we can re-look at it, maybe reframe it in a way that perhaps people can have more examples and create scale around the blended finance concept. And that is that instead of types of finance, perhaps we should look at types of instruments, right? And when I look at instruments, I see three instruments that have to come together in sectors like water, but let's say even in any public infrastructure type space, okay? And those are the following. One, policy instrument of some sort, which needs a government behind it, and an instrument and a government behind it. Second, of course, the finance instrument itself, whether it's debt or equity. I'm always against people trying to come up with these incredible new financial products. You don't have to. We got plenty in the world. We could take it from energy. We could take it from somewhere. We got plenty of financial products. Well, you need that. And then finally, I really think when it comes to sectors like water, you need a social instrument because it is a fundamental human right. Now, when I say that to others, they say, yeah, but there are other sectors like that too. Yes, but yes, I'm sure there are, right? Like nature, biodiversity, you name it. We can come up with a few of them. And so once you combine, perhaps, those three instruments, we start thinking about blended finance like that, maybe we can do more scalable models. Anyway, it's a hope. I don't think it's happened yet, but it has happened in part in renewable energy when, the feed-in tariff combined itself with finance and it scaled money into renewable energy. Right?
How much could we borrow from renewable energy as a path forward? So to pivot from, let's look back to, all right, what might the future be? And what are the models that we can borrow from and modify as necessary? Is it renewables? Is it transportation, healthcare?
It's all of the above, right? I'm sorry to say that, but it is all of the above. Each one of those sectors has an example we could look at. Energy has the feed-in tariff, for example. It's not completely uncontroversial because it had its issues. Okay, it's a subsidy, and those who are against subsidies say, you shouldn't subsidize stuff. Fair enough. But it's all about transition for me. When you go from poor pricing to proper pricing or inadequate finance to scale finance, there's a transition. And along that transition, you do need a different approach and a different set of instruments. The transport sector also has some nice, in fact, if you look at the US, the feed-in tariff type structure was used in transport. But in India, for example, when they wanted to build out their roads, I remember two decades ago, the minister decided that he was going to put a cess of, let's say, 1 penny per dollar in dollar terms of petrol sales. aggregate that money into a ring-fenced pool and use that to offer private investors to build out their roads a guaranteed 18% return on an annuity sort of contract. It was a brilliant move because obviously, who wouldn't? I mean, somebody who knows how to build a road, of course, why would you not want guaranteed 18%? So people came in, people built roads. That was phase one. I can't exactly remember whether it was phase two or phase three, but then he removed that. But by then, people got used to the risk-reward balance in roads, so they weren't looking for guarantees, and they changed it into a hybrid model and so on and so forth. So there are examples we can take, Will, from other sectors, which somehow we don't. So think about that.
It's smart, right? Because it reduces the element of risk from the investors. They know they're guaranteed their 18%. There's a pot of money from which you can feed that 18% across different investors. So what's the possibility of engineering something like that for water if it doesn't happen already? I guess it's the $1 million question, right?
Yeah, even before you offer guarantees, I think we can start with a policy instrument in water, which we haven't. All we need is to don't call it a feed-in tariff, call it something else, okay? Bring investors to the table, different investors. Right now you've got a handful of investors besides the multilateral development banks who are actually putting money into water, private investors. So something like that would be a good start. I go around the world talking about it. Nobody listens to me though. So Will has to go around talking about it. I think it's a good thing. We have to bring money in. Otherwise, we're going to fail.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think, because you mentioned there renewables and obviously like feed-in tariffs for sort of solar panels, and there's this move to decentralized energy, and then you've got that financial incentive to drive sort of people using. There's kind of this start of this trend, and Will can chip in on this as well, of decentralized water production. So actually with like atmospheric water generation and scaling that, and actually then potentially feeding that water back into the grid and then financially incentivizing that. I mean, it's a brave new world that hasn't, I think, been explored. But do you think there's similarities there between the sort of decentralization of energy and then water and some of the tech innovation that's happening?
So absolutely, and I'm very glad you mentioned that. So the other trend, besides looking at water as an overall cycle, is the decentralization of service or decentralization of asset trend. It is already happening in water, by the way. Okay, it's not that we have to wait for it to happen. Actually, it's happening more in water than in other sectors like energy, but both. Let's just say it is happening. And why is it happening? Because population centers are becoming more distributed than they ever were before. It's not that everybody sits around a city limit and you can have one utility supplying them. Number two, smaller cities, peri-urban cities, rural areas are saying we want the same kind of service that New York gets, or whatever it is, whatever big city you're talking about. And then number three, though, and that's the most interesting trend, that the cities themselves are becoming such monsters, huge. I'm sure you've looked at the urbanization statistics, which I can't remember, to be honest, right now, but cities are going to be incredibly large, and there you can't have one utility trying to dig up roads and put in networks and so on. You can't. So so the decentralized model, I think, is the future of basic service provision, I believe. So yeah, I think it's a good trend.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think that's a future point. And so you mentioned atmospheric water. I mean, look, everybody has their likes and dislikes of various technologies, but the overarching point is that when it comes to the decentralized service of one sort or another, technology plays a big role, very big role. It can't just be physical infrastructure. So that is the third trend, the use of technology in water. Will, I hope you agree, but David won't agree, and Xylem won't agree. But I think water is totally under-teched. Okay?
I completely agree with you. I am actually a big fan of air moisture capture as a technology category. It is unclear who's going to be a winner in that. But for us to dismiss it out of hand, and there are a lot of people that you and I know, the three of us know, that write it off because the price point is too high.
Mm.
And they're missing the point that you should not compare it to centralized water delivery. You should compare it to no water delivery or bottled water or trucked in water, and acknowledge some of the big trends that you're talking about in terms of the complexity of cities now and the fabric of a city.
You are right, and actually, that reminds me of yet another report I was involved in. But that goes way back to 2008, I think, 9, called "Charting Our Water Future."
Oh
Right?
yeah,
I did when I was, and that was all around raising the flag on security. Till then, the story was always about access. Okay, people are not. Of course, access is an issue; it continues to be an issue. But now, not now, then, scarcity we thought was something worth raising. So it was a very good report. And there you'll see, Will, if you remember it, we had those water curves, which basically
Yep.
plotted, remember, each thing you could do to save water compared to the cost on the y-axis. And what it showed is that there's a whole bunch of things you can do as a policymaker in a city or a state or a country before you get to some of the more expensive technology. I'm not saying don't do the more expensive. I'm just saying there's a number of things you can actually do, and that's what water management is all about. And that I don't think is happening as well as it should in the world. I don't think
right.
water administrators are administrating or managing. They're just not. So what does that mean, right? So you can save leaks. I don't know what is the average. I lost touch, but what is the average leakage rate in the world? Is it 30?
About 30 to 40%.
Yeah.
That's a lot. So out of every drop, 1/3 or more gets lost. Okay, so you can save that. Now there is my report that I was telling you about, the GCEW will talk about. You can't take all of it out because of the green water thing. Because if you do, for example, drip irrigation or something like that, then really no water seeps back into the soil. So water in soil is actually as important as water in people for our own livelihood and our future sort of ability to live in wherever we are. So I think that, but nevertheless, you can save some water. You can, the whole wastewater subject, and treating wastewater and using that wastewater for non-potable uses, or even recharging aquifers. I mean, there's so many things you can do before doing the more expensive stuff, but always keep an eye on tech. And by the way, it's not just air to water capture and stuff like that, but it's also the use of some of these newer technologies, dare I say it, AI, but also IoT, because one of the things that my report talks about is the lack of credible data in water to make credible decisions. So you need to worry about that. Actually, that's a third thing, Will, because I was in one of these what are they called? Global Future Councils of the World Economic Forum. We came up with something called a water and food stack as a decision-making tool. It was a very interesting one, but I'll leave that on the side.
I will Google that.
Yeah, I think you can get it from the WEF website. It's a pretty
I'll
cool
check
thing.
it out.
My yeah, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, just my co-chair was this guy from Microsoft, so it's not Luddite me trying to put together a stack, but actually he did it. So,
by the way, we're so relieved you used AI because we need to use that term of art in every podcast now. So thank you.
I think it's for the first conversation we've had, and I think one of the first interviews I've done in water where you said water is under teched, right?
Yeah, sorry.
Fascinating.
Right.
No, it's
technologized.
Yeah. No, I love the abbreviations. It's a refreshing viewpoint, because normally people say we have the technology innovation, we have enough widgets and filters and software solutions, but the innovation needs to happen in procurement and business models. So it's the first time I've heard someone say that. It's refreshing to hear, because you're saying in terms of like fulfilling this decentralized sort of vision for water, we need more sort of tech solutions, right?
Well, both soft technology and hard technology. So once you have decentralization, you have distance. Once you have distance, you need data to travel, et cetera, et cetera. You know better than me. So for that reason, we haven't put all the dots together. There may be dots, Tom. There may be. Okay, so whoever's telling you, oh, we've got all, yes, it's probably true. But having technology which is not connected to something else, A, and B, not part of a doable business model is a waste of time and money. So
Right.
what? Right? That's what I mean by under-teched. It's just the whole thing, the whole ecosystem around innovation doesn't yet exist in water.
I enthusiastically agree with you. You know, we are stuck in this model of water tech hubs, accelerators, prize competitions, and then the big companies. And I don't think we are resourced appropriately to take a startup and support them through commercial scale. Now, some of them just need to go away. So I'm not, you know, advocating that, you know, everyone gets to win. But right now, you know, it's not working. It's just not working. And we're falling in love with hubs, accelerators, prize competitions, and hold on to this belief that, yeah, isn't this exciting? And it works, right?
Will,
Yeah.
do you remember the story from Matt Simpson, who was the founder of a tech
Oh,
company?
yeah.
He used the Evel Knievel analogy of the motorcyclist
Yeah.
on the ramp and said, as an industry, we're amazing at launching, of
Yes.
incubating, accelerating new widgets, new ideas. But it's like once that entrepreneur, that founder, that innovator is in the air, it's like we need to work on helping them get further on the landing. On actually, it's not just about launching new things. It's like and he
Right.
had this amazing picture of Evel Knievel kind of taking off on his motorcycle. It's a story that's kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
Matt is an amazing storyteller.
Yeah.
So
I don't know him actually, you know.
Oh,
but
yeah.
no, you're absolutely right. Look, I think that, you know, what happens and what you're right. I mean, actually, if I may just, you know, push a point, Wellers that I joined is a water-focused fund management company and a fund. And that's what we try to do. We realize that there are companies out there and tech out there and technological models out there that need to scale. But in order to scale, of course, they need money, of course, but they need the softer bits too. They need technical assistance. So we provide both. And more people should really think about doing that. I mean, I think Wellers is a really interesting example, which is why I joined them, because I think, you know, we're still kind of very small, but I think, you know, it's an interesting model to look at.
A new model that is refreshing. When I just listened to Usha, I jotted down the stories we tell ourselves about the water sector. You know, like, you know, we have these memes that we believe, and revisiting them and throwing some of them out is really kind of desperately needed at this moment if we're really ever going to make significant progress.
We a classic one, I think, is water reuse, right? And there's always this go-to narrative and perception that there's a public perception issue, but there was a really good study done by, it was a partnership between KWR and the University of Cranfield, and they actually addressed the perception of the perception, and it's not as bad as we think. Because instantly, if you go to any industry conference and you talk about, you know, direct potable reuse, water recycling, everyone's like, oh, it's a political issue, the public don't like it. Well, why do we keep telling ourselves this? This is a viewpoint from over a decade ago. And this university study actually went to examine that and dive a bit deeper. And this is a perception of a perception that now has actually changed, and people are more open to it as a concept because we've matured from a kind of environmental understanding as well. So there's these narratives that are embedded and ingrained that I agree we should actually revisit, and if we need to, kind of chuck them out and start again.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
We should definitely do that, but you have to do that, in my view, not with yet another report, sorry to say, we write lots of them, but you have to do that with some examples where what can we actually action? Take whatever you want and action it, and then put it in a report, because then it would work. But you're right. I think we do have memes, Will. We do have these very sticky conceptions based on the past that I believe are preventing us from moving forward on creating solutions and pathways for scaling up water finance. And I think the last, it's not a trend, the last thing that should, in my view, truly change the narrative and the action on water is climate change. Okay. And so with climate change comes, we have to stop talking about just simply drinking water. It's become a much bigger issue now. It's about water and energy. It's about water and food. It's about water security in and of itself. It's about adaptation and a country's ability to take on both too much water and too little water. So that's, that whole development, not that it didn't exist before, but its connection to water now is much stronger than it was ever before. And we need to use that to push ourselves forward on rethinking and reframing how we act in water.
Speaking of reports, there was another report that recently came out. Obviously, it's March 22nd, World Water Day, so there's a plethora of reports. But I'd love just to get your final thoughts on this. It was a report from World Economic Forum and McKinsey around, let me read out the title. It was Water Futures Mobilizing Multi-Stakeholder Action for Resilience. But interestingly, they kind of came to the systems approach to water, and they had 5 recommendations to a pathway. And I kind of pulled them out and did a social post on them. And the 5 pathways are holistic water valuation, fit for purpose finance, sustained basin level partnerships, adaptive water governance, and collaborative policy innovation nexus. So quite a broad focus, but I'd love to kind of get your quite candid take on this utopic vision of a systems thinking approach to water. Do you think it's possible in our lifetimes? I don't know. I came from a journalist background, so I'm inevitably always quite cynical. And I think, is it actually possible, the systems thinking approach?
Do I have to answer that question? Okay, I will. So what you should have done a blog on is the GCEW report from which this came. Point 1. Okay. But and our report does talk about having to look at the water sector holistically. Remember, I talked about connecting dots and water, but that's holistically or whatever, systems-wide, ecosystem, it's all the same thing. But on those 5 points, I don't see anything particularly earth-shatteringly new, unless what they've said under those headings is new and different from what has been done before, right? And it sounds not suspiciously, but it sounds very much like a model that I believe in, which is my FIGS model, to be honest, where, you have to bring things together and not look at them in individual silos and have unconnected dots and so on in order to make transformation. Transformation does need a systems approach, but it depends on what you actually connect. And that's the most important thing. So I don't know what their report says. They'd sent it to me. I haven't looked at it and I haven't read it, but I will.
Well, we can put a link to the multiple reports, I think, in our YouTube section. But just because I think you mentioned the FIGS model, do you want to quickly maybe just explain that for listeners? Just give us like the elevator pitch.
Oh, come on, go for it, Usha.
Come on,
it's just simply that any transformation in these spaces which involve people and planet, let me put it like that, because if you call it natural resource or whatever, need a few things, right? So the F is for finance, of course, and everything needs finance, no question. But park it to the side. The first I is for innovation, as we were talking earlier. You do need innovation. You need the technology itself. You need the business model. You do, whether it's with or without procurement, whatever. You need all of that. The second I is for infrastructure. We have to come up with better infrastructure models. Decentralization is a very promising one. Maybe there's others. I don't know. We have to really think about it, right? G is for governance, in my view. Governance includes policy, regulation, and then institutions that have to support that in countries. So one of the charting our water future conclusions was water should really become a national level ministry. How many countries do you know where water is a national level issue, like energy is, or roads, or whatever, space and telecom and whatnot? And then the S is for is for social inclusion. And this is particularly true for water, where whatever structure, construct, ecosystem you create, you cannot forget that. You cannot forget that there will always be a need for equity in everything, whether it's by policy, whether it's by pricing, whether it's by infrastructure models, even. You need that social equity, social inclusion. That's it. I mean, it's not like such a big deal, but I like to think of it like this whenever I think about transforming something or transforming a space.
I really like the FIGS model. No, I do. Well, I like FIGS, but I like your FIGS better because, you know, you brought up the issue of, you know, we need to tell stories, we need examples, and this takes the complexity of water, you know, one other thing that we wring our hands on all the time, and reduces it to something that is just clear.
Yeah.
So clear.
And if you were the king of a country, who would you bring around a water table? I would bring representatives of these areas together.
Both of you. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Tom and I are thinking about, you know, starting a new country. So yeah, the timing's
Just
perfect.
make sure you have water. But yeah.
I think the first department will be the Ministry of Water for sure. So it's interesting though, because yeah, I mean, there's environment ministry, right? Environment ministers, but actually a minister of water or ministry of water is kind of unheard of. And this reminds me of a conversation we had at the investor breakfast in Aquatech Amsterdam, where you spoke about, you know, now more multinationals have got someone leading water, but often in the past, water has just been part of sustainability or environment.
Right.
Correct. Right.
So yeah, I totally agree. If there's a dedicated, there's enough of a national security issue and national concern, it's key to everything, that it should have its dedicated, you know, ministry and department.
Yes, and in fact, the UN Security Council does consider climate more broadly writ as one of the areas they should keep an eye on, not do anything about, but it becomes a security risk, the whole climate.
Right.
But in that is water.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's just something to keep. It is in fact a national security issue that should be considered such and should be managed as such. So.
Totally agree. Usha, thanks so much for amazing conversation. There's lots to kind of, I think, go away and pick apart. We'll make sure we put all the relevant links, and I think your FIGS model is wonderful to kind of, yeah, get it, sort of simplify a very complicated issue with different stakeholders and different parts to really get right. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to join and talk to both of you.
Usha, thanks a million.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Tom. Thanks. Take care.
Alrighty. Thanks so much, Usha. Speak soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Be well. Bye.